Good evening. I'm Christian Jewell. I'm the manager of the Asia Pacific Design Library here at State Library of Queensland. You probably know that by now, seeing this is our second last, ninth lecture in the UQ Architecture Lecture Series this year. I want to thank you all for your support of the series so far, and special thanks to UQ for putting on what's been a fantastic series so far. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we gather on tonight, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. I'd also like to just remind you that if you have your mobile phone with you, if you can put it onto silent, we like to encourage conversation using Twitter, using the hashtag APDLlecture. So if you're a tweeter and you'd like to ask a question or share a comment, that's the hashtag. And just a reminder that bathrooms are outside, fire exits, all that kind of stuff. And one other thing is that we're hosting a workshop tomorrow night in the Design Lounge, which is an opportunity, if you're a user of that space, to provide some feedback and ideas for how we can better use that, make it more effective for you. So if you're interested in being involved in that workshop, have a look on the slq.eventbrite.com listing. I'd now like to invite Andrew Wilson to introduce tonight's lecture.
It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Paul Hotston, who has entitled his lecture this evening, Small Practice, Regional Practice, : This goes to the heart of the matter that is most compelling about Phorm Architecture and Design. A small practice located at the crossing of Vulture Street with Boundary Street here in Brisbane. A small practice agile enough to operate locally out of West End and in North Queensland. In a way, that sees the two feeding productively off each other. Recently, I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with Paul and Phorm on a range of projects, and however Paul might frame his work tonight, however forcefully he might express his views, what endures is Paul's ability to remain open to possibilities. Paul.
Thanks, Andrew, for that humbling introduction. Thank you, Lewis and Jono as well, for the invitation / coercion to get me here today to give this presentation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're gathering here tonight, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. Tonight, I'll be presenting the work of my office, Phorm Architecture and Design, which, as Andrew pointed out, is based here in West End in Brisbane. The majority of the works that we've executed within the practice have been located in one of two very specific and quite diverse distinct fields or conditions. Within West End, we have a number of projects which share the same postcode as our office, and they're scattered through the inner city suburb. But at the other pole, the complement of our projects are actually scattered throughout the state, and they literally exist hundreds and in some cases thousands of kilometres away from the practice. And since establishing the office 13 years ago, we've maintained a critical complement of those two project types and locations as a matter of course of the office itself. But perhaps before I talk about the projects, a little bit of brief history might centre things. I grew up here in the southeast corner, but my mother's family came from a small farming community up north in Gavidgin in the Banana Shire, which is about 660 kilometres north, and it rides along the Tropic of Capricorn. And every Christmas, the annual pilgrimage north onto the family property to the grandparents' large timber house, often to play cricket with mum's 11 brothers and sisters and the plethora of cousins. But as a boy, I was always bewildered by the landscape, confused by the heat, but most of all I remember the intense light. And I've since tried to write about my memories of this place, and one of the conditions that I find interesting is the way that I noted that people and objects appeared lighter and thinner in the landscape. And I myself experienced a sensation of almost disappearing in the light, where the white edges burnt the very edges of our being, and the people and the objects around me cast no perceivable shadow. Of course, the architect in me now recognises that I was there on Christmas Day as the passing of the azimuth across the Tropic of Capricorn was directly overhead. So I'd say the batsman there was teeing up at about 12 o'clock. But still, this sense of light and how that imparted itself on the way that I remember the place and my sense of perception and the way that that was affecting me at the time is still carried on. Also, there was a cultural difference between Brisbane and this place, this rural place with its scattered objects, scarce buildings and sparsity. So this experience of a sort of counterculture between the urban and the rural was something that was seeded in me quite young, and probably sent me north straight after university. This is an image that I took 2 weeks ago on one of my trips north. So I was up there travelling between Townsville and Ayr, which is down in the Burdekin, and I was touching base on 4 separate projects. So it's sometimes something that we call the milk run. We were touching base with all those clients in 2 or 3 days. But up in the north, it's the humidity, which is the overarching sort of experience of place. And being in the tropics is being immersed in place physically. You're aware of your body and the edges of your body, air movement, people movement. I find travelling north every time is a visceral experience, and the landscape is enigmatic. This is just on the turn-off out to the James Cook University marine biology labs. In that landscape, there are also buildings. And these buildings tell stories of past and of place. This building, which I just chanced upon last week, is a tobacco drying house with the residents attached. And moving around these buildings in these landscapes, I find spaces akin to the spaces that I try and generate in some of our buildings, court spaces, spaces that have referential scale, things that temper the vastness of the landscape. The detail of the building as well, the way that things are put together, the cultures and the spirit of these buildings are just entirely intoxicating. I realise also that I'm likely to stand accused of being a fly-in, fly-out consultant by the locals and the friends that I had up there in Townsville while I was there. And I did work in Townsville for more than 7 years. But I know that unless you've born there or you've worked there for at least 20 years, you're not considered a local. So I'm hoping with the 13 years that I've had in practice and with constant contact with the North and those 7, I'm almost on the threshold of being accepted. This is the Museum of Tropical North Queensland that I worked on with Cox Rayner in a smaller office that I was working in Townsville at the time. And that's the Ross River in Townsville. The first project I'd like to show you tonight is actually a project that we're just commencing. And I'm probably more interested in imparting some of the process of these buildings than I am showing you the images of them. But in each case, the projects are going to be framed within the landscape and then also in terms of a set of referential building typologies that we find in connection with the sites. So this first project is Canefield House. And this is the model, which is in only schematic design stage that we prepared, situated within its proposed lot, orientated to the correct north. We often work in model, whether it be 3D or SketchUp, or whether physical models, and never in 2D when we're trying to describe our projects in the early part, and always take them on site to actually test them and test relationships that we're trying to impart into the projects. This lot is being cut off or cut away from the family's property. And so there's a very large house with a very extensive garden, and then there's acre upon acre of cane field. And we were pretty much given free rein to go and choose the corner of what cane field we'd like to build this building. This is the landscape at the rear of the existing family home, and it's an intensely planted landscape on the western side of the house, which this day unfortunately doesn't show, but it actually creates a tremendous oasis. It actually creates something of a microclimate on the western side, but it's also the garden in which the owner or our client grew up, and it's the space which the family has nurtured themselves, and it divides the space to the working or the utility part of the farm, which is the cane field. All of our projects are interested in mappings and also defining the boundary for site. So it's never at the edge of the physical boundary of a site. Sometimes the sites extend well out into the landscape, and they're governed by larger landscape features. In this case, one of those earlier images that I showed you was the Mount Elliott Range, which you drive through on the way from Townsville down to Ayr. I've probably done that drive a few times, but Mount Elliott has a weight and a mass. It also has its own microclimate. You can always tell that there are clouds around Mount Elliott even when the rest of the skies are blue. So Mount Elliott has a gravitas, which is also attached to this project. So for us, this proposal at this early stage is about identifying separate landscape elements within and beyond the site that are affecting the placement and positioning of our house. So there's the very large landscape, artificial but created, which is the oasis of the parents' house. And then this is the corner of what is an endless set of cane fields that run out to the west. And for us, we believed in this first sighting that the house should embrace what we described as the green cloud of the parents' garden to the east, because we view that as the key visual amenity, that the house should operate as a threshold or a new threshold to the cane fields beyond, that the house should also avail the occupants a view towards Mount Elliott, and that by utilising the mass of the house we might create a new contrived landscape which would operate at the heart, which is the northeast facing courtyard. So this is the model in situ, looking towards the west with the cane fields behind and the northeast facing courtyard, and that's at about 8 o'clock in the morning. And this is the view back towards the parents' backyard and this oasis or this green cloud of trees, which, given the horizontality of the rest of the Burdekin, is a vertical feature, but also a green feature, which is the centrepiece. And this is an idea about a balcony which will get up, and here I am on the top of a car testing the levels above the cane field, looking out towards Mount Elliott. And that's the detail of Mount Elliott. And it's an important element for us that we escape the site and we include something which is operating at a much larger scale, because this is a way in which we consider ideas such as identity for these people. And every single project that you work on in the north, it just seems to throw up something unusual. In the old house, which is the parents' house, which I think was moved here in about the 40s or 50s, every room on the ground floor has a different hand-painted Italian tile. And I've already been in deep conversations with them about how we can salvage these tiles when and if they demolish this building. And the other thing about this house, which we know, is how dramatic, especially in the Burdekin where they still have the cane fires, just how dramatic this site will be, and that this will be occurring, within metres of the house. And it's something that's been going on, and which within this family is a phenomenon that they're comfortable with. But it's quite intense. And when you're around a cane fire, the sound is just incredible. But the other thing about cane is that it's tidal. So those cane crops, they grow 3 metres every 4 to 5 months. So what you're operating next to is a sort of a tidal plane, where sometimes you can see right across it and other times you're just skirting across the top of the surface. This is a project which I'm sure a few of you will know. It's the Lillesmere Lagoon project. I suppose key to all of our projects is this ideal that each of our projects should occupy the larger relative landscape or cityscape in which it sits. And that what we're trying to derive with each project is a sensibility of place. And we believe that the introduction of architecture must bring about some meaning. And in these virtually exploded sites of the north, just the act of placement is pivotal, but also complex. We have a few questions or mantras that we ask. The first one, if I go back to that, is how do you not mess it up? Sometimes the language is a bit firmer than that. Because I do believe that the introduction of architecture more often than not, diminishes rather than accentuates the landscape. And that issues of placement and what we call displacement are critical. And that we go into these sites that we're offered up with the expectation that the best work we can do will only break even with what we're presented with in the first instance. So there's a lot of energy expelled into trying to make sure that we're accentuating, lifting the site, not taking away, not diminishing. Other points though are how do you fix your compass? The Lillersmere site is 8 hectares. It was once cane field, so it's virtually featureless. I think there was one tree on the entire site. So how do you locate? One of the things in the north is that the sun is a very good compass. So our early work is often about mapping where the sun is, how it works. The winter and summer solstice are broadly apart in the north. The sun's actually moving into the southern sphere in the middle of summer, so it changes the dynamic from what you're experiencing down here in Brisbane. And in this particular instance, the waterway was on the western side of the site, so we had the interference between the view and the sun. The third mantra, or the third idea, is resonance. And how can you make the project draw a breath from the site is the attitude. So how can we make it intrinsic? How can we make it linked to its place? Or what Plasma describes as specificity. These guys have been having a go at me all day about that. I noted at the time, when we were beginning Lillersmere Lagoon, that I had a growing appreciation that everything we would do would be just a direct consequence of actually inserting the piece of architecture into the landscape. That instigating this initial occupation of the land and the habitation of the land is the immediate concern. I think it also was the beginnings of an understanding of your own cultural short-term engagement with place. Our newness and, in a sense, our lack of belonging requires a lot of work. In this particular instance, what we mapped as important was the vertical element of the sugar mill, refining mill across the way, and also the small cane train bridge that was located more or less downstream. And these two axes, once we located them and then pinned the plan, if you like, to the intersection of the two lines, started to make a lot of sense. So this is that early model making and mapping. This is the upstream view towards the cane bridge. And that's what that space became eventually. And along the other axis, which is the through axis or the skew axis, is we're moving through towards the one vertical piece in the whole landscape, which is the mill chimney. And that's that centrepiece running through the centre of the plan there. What became really interesting for us is that when we were given such a vast site and trying to determine how and where to place it, eventually we did make decisions, and then I was on site with the builder. The guy looking at me intently is P.O. Borelli. And I actually had to say we have to move this building and we have to rotate it through another 5 degrees so that I can get that line perfect and these things are going to be exactly as we want them. And something clicked at that moment when you realise that things are becoming specific. Other things happen too. The builders often deride the architect. We were sitting in this space, which is the living room space, which as you can see is framing the cane train bridge, which delivers all the cane through to the refinery in the cutting season. And they were just having lunch there and taking another opportunity, I think, to take a slide at me, when suddenly the cane train moved through that space. And almost all of them stopped and watched the train and suddenly realised what the space was doing. And from that point on, when they realised that the house was actually framing their place, was actually acknowledging the way that things operate in their landscape, there was some degree of respect. These other buildings are always impressive and tremendous. So this is the refinery, and it's unconscious architecture. It's the architecture without architects that Radolfsky talks about. But it's very powerful. And some of these buildings are really, for us, were the touchstones that allowed us to see that architecture could actually stand up to the landscape. And some of them are just very simple, but there's a certain honesty, and there's something which is innately correct about some of these buildings. Again, those same builders, as they were building it, had nicknamed this house the Crab Hut. And this is what a crab hut looks like. This is down on one of the creeks where you can hear the crocodiles roaring. But they probably couldn't have realised that, in fact, that was the highest compliment that they could have paid me, and that, in fact, that was the very intention of the piece and where we'd taken our leads from. At the time we finished that project, I was aware of a book on Marlon Blackwell, which is the architecture of the Ozarks. And it's not specifically his architecture that took my interest, but rather that I could see in the book and in his work, he was witnessing something specific and had a shared admiration of not only the landscape, but also these small, unaffected buildings which he'd found in the landscape. Blackwell describes them as a constructed ugliness, but somehow reinvests new meaning and poetry in the utilisation of these forms in his work, transforming what he describes as the ordinary into extraordinary. But I could recognise that these were similar traits to the way that we'd approached the Lillesmere project, and that we were trying to borrow from the working knowledge of these buildings rather than house typologies to make connection with site, belonging with site. The quote that I do like, though, from that book is that the colours, shapes, textures, I would add scales and skies, become the silent collaborators in the work. They are not the setting, they are the inspiration. So that's that project. The next project is in a very small coastal community called Seaforth, which is about an hour north of Mackay. And you walk through this dune, this dense dune, and you walk out onto this ridiculous landscape, almost lunar. The tides up there go out about 2 or 3 kilometres. But when you look at it from the Google map, you realise how dry and parched and how arid this particular area is. And most of these houses are basically evolutions, if you like, of the crab huts that I was just showing you. But in that landscape of all those buildings, we go in and investigate, and in there is always majesty. So the first couple of slides are our house, but the second one, which is a beautifully proportioned fibro building, I've termed that one the Palladian Villa, and then Corb's Villa Savoy in the middle, and then finally one of Gary's kind of lesser known works. But all of them contain a quality of the lock up and leave mentality. These are not permanent residencies. They are occasional, and when people are there, they're there en masse, and they're there with boats, and they're there with fishing gear, and so there's rigour in the construction. The clients asked us to come and have a look at this house with the idea of building a new house. They then gave us the budget, so we told them we'd be using the old house, which turned out to be a very, very great thing, because the old house actually was built by his father, and so had longevity and connection to the site. I didn't have any paper that day, so the initial designs are on that coconut there. So when I did get some paper, it got pretty simple. We'll pick up the house, we'll turn the house around, because it's facing the street, which is west, on its long side. It's a beautiful 60s house, aluminium roof, perfectly intact. So we'll reuse the house, we'll turn it, we'll spin it, we'll move it forward on the site, and we'll just add a small tower and an elevated deck, and then if we're lucky, we'll have Christmas lunch on the deck. So this is the elevated deck, which takes a small northeastern view across to the bit of water, but as you can see, you're presented with the foredune, which is a green space, which I think is the saving grace, actually, of the beachfront there, because instead of everyone clamouring just for water view, everyone has to sustain themselves, and the walk through that green screen down onto the beach is that kind of brilliant moment every day. The tower initially had an intention of not having any glass. We ended up with a couple of small panes in the corner, but the idea again is that all the openings simply lock up, shut down and close down, and then you go home. The louvers are on 3 sides, so you can modulate the light and the sun depending on what time of day and where you are. But this idea of the pathway, and the pathway as part of a journey leading up to the house and continuing through the house and then beyond the house and into the principal landscape is a feature of most of our planning and the return. Still travelling further down the coast, this is a project that we completed in Agnes Waters, Crow's Nest House. It's a project that was instigated by a couple here in Brisbane who thought they could drive 6 hours north every weekend to celebrate the coast. I think I might have spent just about as much time as they have on that site. But there's a lot of rigour in the investigation and these mappings that we undertake with each project. So this is a cherry picker that we've organised for the site, and we're mapping the view and that changing relationship as we move through what are potentially 2 or 3 levels of the house. All of the surveying takes in a sort of a nominated spectrum of key landscape and cultural buildings or significant vistas. And this project in particular, the clients were so excited by entering into this new community that they wanted to build a building that would have some sort of dialogue back down into the fledgling Main Street. So there was almost an idea of the folly. And so on that day, I think Morgan might have helped us out that day, we're just up there starting to test, what it would be like to actually place a building or an object on the top of that hill, and what sort of dialogue might we instigate with the Main Street. Of course, the drive up to Agnes Waters entails, again, passing through incredible regions and towns, and discovery of even more of these spectacular structures. So this is a fire watch tower on the outskirts of Maryborough. And just looking at the detailing, the tectonic, how lean this structure is. And some timber mills, a single span through there with just those logs. I think we find what we're doing is cataloguing these relationships between these small objects and these large landscapes, and how they power up, how they manage. And sometimes just the simple act of framing the landscape and how that occurs is critical. So the proposal is basically of two parts. There's a sort of folly element which sits on the top of the hill, and then a very lightweight set of rooms that cantilever off the hill. And those are the early sketch work. It always surprises me that clients are willing to support architects when they come forward with this sort of work. But that plan didn't change all that much. Again, I think that plan was after the first trip or second trip up, and that's what it finally evolved into. Courtyard again, or the raised deck at the centre. In this case, the building is literally wrapping itself around and protecting the deck from the very, very progressive southeasterly breezes, which is pruning all the trees on the hill, and really had to be managed if you were going to occupy the outdoor room. Again, the plan is locking itself into very specific views that we want to orchestrate, and there's a certain choreography that goes on within the plan. Other simple observations, up there at Agnes Waters, because there's very little settlement, people, at night time there's no light, and the night sky has just become this incredible canvas. So we had to encourage the clients not to enclose the outdoor deck, but rather to investigate a number of what we described shadow casting devices that would manage the light through the day, but then afford them the view to the night sky in the evening. And these similar sort of frames, like the ones that we're finding of particular views, and a final invitation to stand up in front of the Titanic. And that's the piece. I think there are other sub-agendas always. At Agnes Waters, a lot of the architecture is more or less suburban architecture that's just been moved down onto the coast. There's a lot of block work, a lot of brick, a lot of quite what I would describe as relatively passive work. So we took it upon ourselves to talk about a palette and to try and instigate something which would have a much higher degree of affinity with the landscape, following the tree line. Getting closer to home now. This is a briefing document from our client. The client's the guy in the middle. So he gave us a small portfolio of images from his youth and basically said, I want something that reminds me of this place. There's images of Noosa before it became Noosa. You can just see Hastings Street here, which has now been extended through to there, and this is the beginning of the Sound. And shots taken from a house of a couple of shacks. This is near Coolum, and that other shot is obviously looking up towards Noosa National Park with AB Bay behind. This house, though, is the house of his uncle, and he had a particular connection to this place, and a memory about being brought in and underneath the roof. We were given a site in behind Noosa Junction. It was actually in a subdivision, but it was on the edge of a very large natural reserve, and one of the more fortuitous things about the subdivision was that they'd kept all the trees between the street and the lots, so there was a sense of enclosure. And we were fortunate enough to be the first in the subdivision to build, but it meant we had to anticipate all the neighbours and what they would do. And so any strategy that we had to almost map and mass what would come. They're long, narrow sites, not too dissimilar to the sites that we deal with back here in Brisbane. So we kind of knew to be tough on ourselves on the two sides, which happened to be north and south, and that set up an axis through the east to the west. Again, you can see in this image here the invitation up the stairs and then a descent through a rear stair. That idea again of the pathway that comes through, bisects the plan, kind of visits the principal space, but then continues on and then continues out into the landscape. And there's never a front door. So this is the view looking east, which is the morning space, which is taking in that canopy of trees that flank the street. But meanwhile, on the western side, we're dipping the lid of the brim of our hat as low as we can, but still affording ourselves a small view through to Mount Timbeerwah. And it's certainly a much more elegant beach shack, but I think it's still operating with all the same sensibilities. And simple devices such as the stair. So to move through the house is to go back outside and go downstairs. There's no internal stair. Or to move through spaces to visit the central space. Forces a certain interaction with the landscape and the principal room. And that's the path back down and into that larger landscape. Okay, this is the last of the northern projects I was going to show you, and it's the first. So this is the Allman House in Mackay, and I think that photograph's at least 10 years old, so the architect was much younger then. In my own words back then, I declared that I would like this house to be an exploration in placemaking through materiality. The sectional ideas within the design, I'll talk about that in a minute. The idea of connecting to place through material was at the core of this building. And at the same time, I was very interested in a set of artists and people that were working by moving, if you like, nude or naked out into the landscape and constructing pieces of art. I was interested in the idea of the empty hand and being able to construct that, but also about things that connected so intimately to place and things that also had quite a temporal nature to them. The sectional idea for the plan for the building was an idea about how to counterpoint this vast view that was on offer from the top of the hill out over the cane fields and along the coastline, with having a sense of a kind of refuge to balance the prospect. And in that, one of the archetypes was Schindler's house. That transferred into the building. But I think one of the key ideas for the building was a set of fractured spine walls that ran right through the length of the plan, with the rest of the rooms anchoring off those. These walls were made of materials that we were able to assemble more or less from the adjacent site. So that the soil came from a friend and a farm. The aggregate, which was an exquisite purple aggregate, came from nearby Serena, and the sand came from the Pioneer River nearby. So the notion was to connect the construction to the site, and in doing so create an element which would inherently belong. It was a deep-seated desire. The rammed earth person said, if you make the walls from the site, they will always look correct, they will always belong. And I think it was this search for authenticity which was at the drive of this house at the time. But back then, I think there was also a notion of trying to construct a prehistory for the site. And the idea of the ruin that the building would reconstruct itself around. And I think this is really at the core of this project, and it's been something that I've been able to revisit since, is this idea that there was some form of pretense or denial about how limited the connection really was to the landscape, both from time and experience. So I think at this point I started to understand this idea of how new we are and how surface we are. And so this building celebrates a making of place through permanence, whereas in fact it's the starting point, or the agenda point for me, for a study of the idea of the impermanent place, which is more or less what I believe the condition that we're operating in is. The walls obey other simple logics. They run through the house on an east-west axis, as the termite mounds in North Queensland will instruct. Very, very broad on the north and south face, and knife point edge on the east and west. So this idea of permanence in the building was a sort of springboard, and I think at a later point I realised that what I was doing was constructing a sense of place through permanence, and that permanence reflects a very Eurocentric point of view, that it's all about making place and making connection through association, not through making connection to the actual place and site. So it's a reconstruction of the old world. If we have a look at other societies such as Asian and more particularly the Pacific, then we start to understand that there's an acceptance of this condition of impermanence. And I think that this is where we're starting to understand our work belongs in association too. If I come back down to Brisbane now, which is the other complementary half of the office, we're dealing with very, very tight, very, very bespoke house lots that contain houses that are now had histories of about 100 years. And it's a very, very different set of conditions that you operate architecture under. They're very Brisbane spaces, they're very Malofian in their references. This understory of the house at Wynot Street I described as being a place of unpatriated objects, uncontested histories, a world of patina, rawness and honesty. It's an understory. We've been very fortunate at Wynot Street that we've been able to install a series of additions and minor alterations to a house. We've done 3 of them now, and there's designs for more. But I think in each case what we've tried to do is to exercise something which we believe is extending the essential character of the existing house and the sensibilities of the cottage rather than add new. Philip Cox, in a moment of raw emotion back in 1969, described that by the 90s, and I'm describing the 1890s now, They're developed in parts of New South Wales and particularly Queensland, a type of building which is usually square in plan, raised off the ground, with a tight box of rooms, whose timber bones showed, surrounded by verandas, topped off with a pyramid roof. Growing logically and out of the physical causes around it, it had a distinct character and is the closest thing that, in his opinion, Australia has ever come to producing an Indigenous architecture. These are just a set of small additions that we've engaged with the existing house, but at all times trying to maintain the legibility of the original structure. But these buildings have survived in Brisbane under a decree of protectionism, which was thrown over these inner city suburbs in the 70s and 80s to protect our identity as a city. They're beautiful and they're 100 years old, and they're quite close to this point where Brisbane was just a settlement, an encampment, which is a reference point which we seek in our work. There's an experience of working in those northern climes and those northern sites which I think has honed our senses into searching for what we see as the impermanent city within Brisbane. We're looking for responsive architectures, the same things that we find in the regions, the unpretentious, the honest, the simple, the strong, the things that offer a much deeper experience of place. This encampment, this is Brisbane. We believe ever since we started building, we've been unbuilding. That basically there's always been a state of replacing the encampment or the basic settlement with mass, with permanence, and with a move towards that Eurocentric sense of a city. That the fact that this is going on in a sort of unquestioned manner, an unconscious manner, is the issue that we need to address. Another quote by Cox out of the rude timber buildings in Australia was that the early Australians had an aversion to timber as a permanent building product. Timber was accepted only for the temporary and the makeshift. The preference for brick and stone or imported product that pushed the timber buildings out of the towns existed in any area where that area had surmounted its immediate pioneering condition and was achieving a degree of permanence. When we look up from these inner city suburbs in West End and look across the river to the city, it's hard to see how that city manages the same level of specificity as the buildings that we're dealing with, which are 100 years old, which have their connections in that encampment. The questions that we're asking ourselves are, what does this mean for a subtropical city? How does this awareness of what we call the impermanent city question whether we're on a line towards or away from the ideal subtropical place? It's indeed a very rare feature to be operating within a city that's barely 150 years old, and some of the towns that we do work in up north are less than 100 years old. So I see the development of this idea of moving away from origins as not necessarily a good thing, that the lessons of the architectures that we're encountering on all these travels and as part of the works that we're doing are informing us that in fact these buildings are much more suited to defining the experience of place than many that we find in the CBD. I do see in the residential architecture that there has been a transference of ideas and experiences from the Queenslander into a modern style. But within the CBD, which has been left to itself to define itself, it's moving towards the international city. And it lacks anything of the subtropical distinctiveness that Rosemary Kennedy described in her call for a subtropical city. Last year I was participating out at the University of Queensland, and one of the students there, Leah Gallagher, as part of her research, has started to bring forward a set of images of Brisbane at a different time. And each one of these images struck a deep chord with me in terms of looking at an architecture that was essential, that was of place, and that was working within very, very tight confines and economies. This very, very slight structure here on the banks of the river, I think is sublime in the way that it details, and I'm pretty sure that architects such as Peter Suchbury would be quite proud to have his name connected to something like this. For us as an office, this idea of the impermanent subtropical city is not concerned with palette and aesthetics. What is critical about it is the authentic architectural expression and experience which links back to place. And one of the things we've identified for ourselves as a practice is this idea that we might not be able to affect the CBD immediately, but there is a number of ring sites around the city where the city is invading. So particularly in West End, there's a whole bank of lots where the CBD has basically jumped the river and imposing its own logic and its own characteristic. And what we believe should be happening is that the sensibilities of the Queenslanders should be the things that are on the vanguard. So we've identified a mid-scale building which typically come with a more diverse program, a hybrid typology as the ideal vehicle to try and impart some of our thinking of the subtropical city. There's only one or two examples that I can give you when we've been able to break away from residential work. And one of them is the Sanford Valley Steiner School Library, which Paolo Denti and Pentaki invited us to co-author the hall in the library as part of the Burrs project. It's a simple brief. There's only $1 million to build a library. I think we had 8 weeks to design and document it. And Jolt in the audience will be well aware of those timeframes. But this building is a wholly timber frame building from the stirrups up, and it imparts some of the language and sensibilities that we would hope for larger scale buildings. There's an idea of the culture of timber and the light weight within the landscape which we enjoy, but also the simple expression of structure. Most important of all within the plan is the non-specified loggia, which is the central space, which is very akin to the courtyard planning of our houses and other projects, which affords the building a new room, a new typology, but also starts to break down the barriers set up by air conditioning and division within the plan. The other thing which is key about this space is that it's in the landscape. So it's about arriving into the building and then reframing the landscape in which you occupy. And ultimately, we hope that the experience of coming to the building is more akin to one of visiting the landscape than that of an interior. The way in which the building sits in the landscape, we've worked around the existing trees. I think there was only one tree that had to be removed. This plan of the loggia as the central space, and again within a very, very tight budget, we were able to argue this because we could actually compress some of the more high-end and needy spaces which required air conditioning and externalise much of the circulation of the building and much of the program, and that offsetting allowed us to construct the space. What was particularly satisfying was seeing that the builders seemed to understand exactly what we were doing, and they constructed a very similar space with their trucks outside. The other building, which is not a constructed building, is a proposal for a mid-scale, mid-rise building commercial development in Townsville. The idea of the building, first of all, advocates for what we called a consolidated city rather than a tower model. So Townsville at the time was, and still is, going through a transition where it has a consolidated scale that operates across the whole width. And now there's 1, 2, 3 or 4 towers that are drawing people up out of the ground plane, but setting up isolated points within the city. The consolidated plan allows for connectivity, porosity, and basically is built on the sort of mindset of the termite mound, where you construct shaded, protected walkways that link public space, Main Street, and into a range of buildings so that people can still utilise the city outside in the middle of summer. There's a lot of ground floor connectivity in the design, but the key idea for the building was the re-release of a very, very narrow site. So the site is 20 metres by 100 metres. What we found that we were able to do in the design was reorientate the plan essentially towards the north. And in doing so, we set up the whole plan behind a large brise soleil, which was then the internal wall set back inside 3 metres to alleviate all the issues of fire, which meant that all the internal partition walls could be lightweight timber, operable glass, external balconies, and also set up a much more efficient plan, which only had a certain depth of 15 metres. All the servicing's on the south, because again in North Queensland the sun moves into the southern sphere in summertime. Sorry. The reason that we were able to achieve this was that we identified very early in the design that the buildings that operated along the northern edge that faced Denham Street, 80% of them were either heritage and therefore could not be redeveloped, or they were actually owned by the developer himself. So what we're able to do then is avail all that airspace over the top of those buildings, and in doing so change the intent of the building. What's also critical for us though is that this was the site which at one end held the Buchanan Hotel, which was a significant building in its time, and the detailing of that screen wall was an inspiration for the redevelopment of the site. But there are other buildings in the same street. This building is actually on the same Denham Street further up the hill, exhibiting the same ideology along that northern face, setting up a break wall between the glazing and the intense light and heat. Not sure how I'm going for time. I think there's a specific role for small practice, and there's a few in the room I recognise. But I think small practice is a place, an incubation hold for ideas. That the research that goes on in a small practice is akin to like a longitudinal study. That there are a number of people who are investing time into projects over a very, very long time. And so that longitudinal knowledge starts to constitute something meaningful. We're also the documenters of particular places, of buildings and communities, and I think we have a key role in mentoring, teaching, and advocacy. Currently, we're undergoing an unprecedented sort of engagement with collaboration, and I wanted to talk about a couple of those collaborations quickly. But I have to preface that by saying that the greatest collaborators that we have are our clients. And there's a pair of clients up on the Mullaney Range at the moment at Belthorpe, and they're constantly taking us to another level in terms of the way that they brief and the way that they list their sensibilities towards the site. So instead of getting a brief for a house, we get a Chinese masterpiece. And at the same time, this is a photograph taken within their site. So there's an acute awareness of what they're after. And when we look at their avocado fields and we get excited by contour lines and we say the contour line is an important man-made line into the landscape, and perhaps that holds importance for the way we might site and plan a building, they're on board immediately. And when we look at that same hill and we see these dolomite rocks that are interred in the process of agriculture, and we say we could make something out of these rocks, they take themselves off and immediately do a dry stone walling course. So what we're finding is that they're not only the financiers of our ideas, but they're also the facilitators of our ideas and their houses. The investment in residential work can never be underestimated. That's why I'm so interested in maintaining that. The other collaborations, of course, are the ones that are internal into the practice. And everybody on that list has given everything that they had at the time to the practice and to the work that we were doing. I'd particularly like to thank the team that I've got on board at the moment, who have pretty much been responsible for getting me here. But it's been an intense process, and every day that I turn up to work, the way in which the office operates defies the idea of a sole practitioner. It's always been a team, it's always been a collaboration, and the work registers that. There are other collaborations that are going on at the same time, and they're significant for my small practice, and one of them is the work that we do with Pentaki. The Burrs project managed both the hall and the library for $2 million, and both projects were awarded Sustainability Architecture Awards at the State Awards last year. The same collaboration has gone to the next stage, and we've actually finished a project down on the northern New South Wales coast, which is Surfing Australia's headquarters and the High Performance Centre, which is an entirely new typology and the first of its kind in Australia and possibly even the world. And so that's another fantastic project. And I think working in a small office, and Paolo's office is also relatively small, is that it affords you a certain capacity and the opportunity to work on projects larger than the ones we typically do. Another collaboration is one that we're undertaking at the moment with Base Architecture. We were involved in a developer site down on the North Gold Coast doing independent work. We were invited there to do relatively traditional things, design houses for blocks, and then we were approached independently to put in a tender for a very large parcel of work. And both of us basically had the same idea at the same time, that instead of competing, we should combine. And we've been successful in securing that work, which is going to be very, very significant. I think also what's important in that relationship is also an understanding that we'll be independent, but also working together. And I think somehow the 2-for-1 offer to the developer was too good to turn down. We do a lot of competition work in the office. We try and do at least 1 or 2 competitions a year, but sometimes competitions come along that you simply can't refuse. Australia House was a fantastic project, but I also had 2 people that were associated with the office or working in the office, Akari and Yohei, who were obviously deeply affected by things with the tsunami in Japan. And the Australia House project seemed a part of that national rebuilding process. And their mantra was simply, we must. And those guys just mustered it all the way through. Some exquisite model making by Yohei. And also some artwork by a friend of mine, Keith Burt, who also collaborates with us on a number of presentations. We've also put in a bid for the Gold Coast Cultural Centre. Some of the students who are here today who I've been teaching know that I opted out of the lodge competition in favour of this one. That wasn't very fair of me. But we were invited by international practices, and I think Andrew and I were offering up a set of local sensibilities about the site, about the Gold Coast, about what it was, what it might be, how it could function. And we're essentially honing a set of international ideas for the local competition. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. We're honoured at present to have been nominated as the Brisbane counterpart to work on a bespoke residential project here in Brisbane with Yoshimada-san. And we're just about to undertake the first meetings. We've met with the client and been on the site, and the client is aspirational. So we're very just interested in the way that the dynamic will progress. But at this stage, it seems like it will be an entirely focused project. It's being blogged. But we also undertake the same set of studies about site. We're determining our own sort of set of sensibilities about where we are, and we'll see how that impacts on the general approach. We sent a few postcards over to Japan. I think it's a particular vocation to actually live and work in the regions. I treasure my opportunities to be there, but I'm hoping that most of you are already aware of the fact that later on this year in September, the Institute, or the Queensland chapter of the Institute, is staging its first state conference. And my friend Stephen de Jersey, who we met up in Townsville, is putting together something which I think will be the equivalent of a watershed moment for the regions, something on the same sort of kilter as Placemakers was here in Brisbane. So I encourage all of you, even those that have been down to the Southern Conference, to head north this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. That was a fantastic overview of your career to date. Any questions for Paul?
There's a very important game of soccer that's going on right now, so it's perfectly okay if we need to leave the building.
Paul, I first knew of your existence when I was living in Melbourne because you took a job at Edmund and Corrigan, and Maggie Edmund and Peter Corrigan are both very good architects, I think, but you were on the radar because people take note of anyone.
I think they took notice because all the schools had blacklisted Peter at that stage, and I walked in completely naive, and he said, "You've got the job."
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I look at the list of people that you've collaborated with, there's a similar list that you could project for that practice. But I guess what did you take from that time in Melbourne, given that you've talked about being in Townsville I think we understand your education here in Queensland.
Yeah, I think Melbourne is a place that you can respond to very quickly. It's very urban, and obviously the architectures down there reflect upon that. Working in Peter's office particularly, though, there's this idea that he has about playfulness and engagement with community. I think he's often talking to non-architects, and I did learn a lot working with him to not be thoughtless about any surface or any element of the building. I mean, he obviously is looking for every opportunity to play another trick, but I think it's an interesting consideration that there is no back of the building. He's constantly deriving that, and some of his internal planning too is actually quite interesting in the way that he moves people through space. Yes.
So, any questions from the floor?
Thanks again, Paul, for your talk. You seem to be a cataloguer of landscape and typologies, which is really interesting. I was wondering, when you were siting up the house up north, which you described as more like your crab hut,
Yes, crab hut.
and you're relating to constructed features in the landscape to site on, and also more natural features. Have you ever been put in a position where there is nothing that really engages your eye in the landscape to site on, if there's not a structure or a mountain or a...
Well, I think all those sites, there's things which are just dramatic and immediate, but the site like Lillysmere takes time. So whilst the towers of the mill are kind of there, and that, like I said, they're that vertical element that you, over time, you just realise you can't deny that. Finding those axes, if you like, or finding the things that register and that are important takes time. And I think it's about occupation. Sometimes, as I say, some of the clients have very acute sensibilities of where they are, and they'll point out things. In that particular case, that couple had been living in that town for 25 years, but they only just bought that land. They knew nothing about it. And they were a retiring couple, and again, every idea that I proposed, they more or less accepted. And it wasn't until, the building started to form itself around those axes that they would have fully understood what I was trying to do for them. But I think it's about osmosis, and I think sometimes we go beyond the site. When we don't find things that are immediate, we start talking about adjacencies or things that operate at a much larger scale. So it's only my awareness of Mount Elliot. To be honest, when we went up last time, and I said, if you stand on the roof of that car, you'll get a view of Mount Elliot. And he'd been living in that house and that property his whole life, and he said, no, not when the cane's this high. And then he got up there and saw that, and they both said, right, we're going to have that deck.
Any other questions?
Hi. Paul, you designed a lot of things up in Townsville and Cairns and very cyclonic regions. You didn't mention anything about certain features you must have designed in a lot of those buildings to counteract cyclones.
Yeah. Well, the Crow's Nest house had 2 cyclones pass through it while it was under construction. So, yeah, when I graduated from university, I went straight to Townsville for 7 years. So in a way, all of my knowledge of structure has all been based in those conditions, those high cyclonic conditions. So even now, I think I tend to weight things heavier than the engineers down here. But there's a couple of strategies that I hold in the houses to try and make them light. So one of them is that you can compress a lot of bracing into a number of very small masonry blades, and also you can assist that with a little bit of steel framing. So what you do is you sort of pull it down into a number of very, very fine elements that you sort of hide or you seed into the plan, and then all the lightweight elements are able to hang, if you like, off that, and it has that stability. We do a lot of work on islands up in that area, and you literally have to design in cyclonic rooms because they simply wouldn't get off the island in time. So there is an acute awareness of that. Crocodiles as well.
Could you please join with me in thanking Paul?